each of us hold incredible power. Power to be anything we choose to be. The power to shape our reality or pursue the courage of our actions and dreams. But too often, we surrender that power. We blame others for our failures and the obstacles in our path, and for the dreams we never cared to chase. Yet the truth is simple. No one can take from us what we do not give. No one has the power to steal our strength, our ambitions, unless we freely give it to them. The sage understood this better than anyone. He believed every individual is a force of nature, capable of great things when we stand firm in our purpose. But even he, someone so wise, fell victim to the darkness, letting his power slip into the hands of others. Tonight, we delve into his story, a story of one who sought to protect the balance. The tale of the sage reminds us that we are all our own highest priority in our own lives, and that the only real battle is that within ourselves. So as you listen to the sage's tale, ask yourself, what are you truly capable of when you do not let others steal your light? The sage's origin. The sage stood before his army of elders, a vast sea of glowing eyes and pale faces, their power palpable in the cold night air. Normally, elders were fiercely independent, each bound by their own will, desires and ambitions. They were not pack-minded creatures, nor did they follow commands easily, but under the sage's influence, they were united, compelled to do his bidding. Such dominance was unheard of in the vampire world. There had never been an elder like the sage. He was not just another victim of vampirism. His transformation had been deliberate, with a purpose far greater than himself. Before becoming what he was now, the sage had been a man of extraordinary intellect, a scholar whose wisdom was unmatched. Even as a mortal, he was known by the name Mephion, a name that evoked strength and confidence in wisdom, and it was that wisdom that would shape his destiny. The scene shifted back in time to the early 13th century, in the heart of a crumbling European empire. Mephion sat in the grand library of an ancient castle, surrounded by shelves, stacked with tomes of knowledge and scrolls of ancient wisdom. His face was calm, thoughtful, as he studied an old manuscript, with eyes that saw far beyond the words on the page. Across from him sat Kalen, an elder vampire whose presence commanded respect. Kalen was old, older than most, and his name, meaning mighty warrior, was a testament to the strength he once held. But now, Kalen had long since traded his physical strength for the sharpness of his mind. He had seen the world, both the world of men and the world of elders, and he had witnessed its corruption. "Mephion," Kalen began, his voice low and grave, "there is a sickness spreading through both our worlds. Man and elder alike are driven by greed, each taking what they can for their own benefit, without thought for the consequences. The rulers of men steal from those who work hardest, bleeding their people dry, while elders prey upon the weak, feeding without restraint. I see corruption everywhere, and if it continues unchecked, it will bring about the end of all things." Mephion set down the manuscript and regarded Kalen thoughtfully. "Greed is not confined to man or elder," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It is the nature of the weak to take from those who produce more, to tear down those who achieve, and to strip away what is earned by effort. Men seek to steal from the highest producers and give to those who produce nothing, all under the guise of justice. Elders, too, take without thought, feeding endlessly from the weak, offering nothing in return. Corruption festers when the strong are forced to support the weak, when the individual is sacrificed for the sake of the collective. Kalen nodded, his expression grim. And you believe this corruption can be stopped? Mephion's gaze hardened. I believe that the only true path is for each individual to strive to be their best self, to rely on no one else, and to demand no unearned rewards. When others seek to steal from the individual, whether by force or through deceit, that is when corruption takes root. The individual is the most powerful force in the world, but both men and elders seek to strip away that power, to drain it for their own gain. Kalen's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. You speak of strength, of self-reliance, but you also see what I see, do you not? This imbalance, this unchecked greed, will not stop on its own. If left unchecked, it will destroy both the world of men and the world of elders. Mephion paused for a moment, weighing Kalen's words. Normally, he began, I would not sacrifice my time or energy for the sake of another. My highest priority is myself, my needs, my growth. I do not concern myself with the whims or weaknesses of others, but... His voice trailed off, and his eyes met Kalen's. This imbalance you speak of, it will not only destroy them, it will eventually harm me as well. If the world is torn apart, there will be nothing left for even the strongest to survive. So yes, I will help, but know this, I do so for my own sake, not for theirs. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Kalen's lips. That is more than enough, Mephion. With your wisdom, we can stop the destruction that is coming. You are the one who can restore the balance, both for men and for elders. And in doing so, you may yet save yourself. Mephion's gaze remained steady, but within him a decision had been made. He understood the truth of Kalen's words. The balance that held the world together was fragile, and while he would never sacrifice himself for the sake of others, he would do what was necessary to ensure his own survival. The corruption of the weak would eventually infect even the strongest, and that he could not allow. You will have my help, Mephion said at last. But this balance, if it is to be restored, must be done without forcing others to bend to the will of the collective. Each being must learn to stand on their own, to embrace their own strength. If they fail to do so, then the destruction they bring upon themselves is deserved. Kalen nodded slowly. You are the one, Mephion, the elder who can guide us through this storm. The scene shifted back to the present. The sage, once known as Mephion, now stood as a being of unimaginable power. His golden eyes swept over his army of elders, creatures who had once been free-thinking, but were now bound to his will. The individualism he once cherished had been consumed by the dark power that now coursed through him, twisting his philosophy into a singular desire for dominance. As the storm rumbled overhead, the sage looked skyward, his lips curling into a smile. This was just the beginning. This is but the start, he whispered to the heavens, his voice filled with fury. Soon the world will know the wrath of the sage. And the balance he had once sought to preserve would be shattered forever. The sage's army swept across the known lands like a black plague. Villages crumbled, cities were reduced to ash, and fields that once sustained life now lay barren, soaked with the blood of the fallen. The humans fought back with everything they had, but it was in vain. The elders, bound to the sage's command, moved with terrifying precision, their power unstoppable, their hunger insatiable. Each conquest left the world darker, emptier, as if mankind had no hope, no future. It was as if the very essence of life itself was being drained from the earth. The sage, at the head of his legion, was a force unlike anything the world had ever seen. No man, no army, no kingdom could stand against him. His influence was spreading, and with each victory, it seemed the time of man was ending. The age of the elder had begun. The scene shifted to a land of utter darkness, where nothing grew, and death was all that remained. The ground was cracked and decayed, and the air itself seemed lifeless. This was no ordinary place, but a realm where even the shadows feared to linger. In this desolate wasteland, a voice echoed, a deep, cold voice that carried the weight of eternity. But no figure could be seen, only the overwhelming presence of death and destruction.
You think me a fool, Thorn?
The voice dripped with disdain. The unseen speaker mocked, as if addressing someone unworthy of attention.
Your father, as weak and foolish as he is, clings too tightly to the balance. He would never allow this to happen. You expect us to war with him? To make a place for you among gods?
A rumbling laugh followed, bitter and filled with contempt. The unseen speaker was not amused, but disgusted.
Fool. Your pathetic plan is like that of an ant trying to take down a lion. Your schemes are insignificant. You think you can manipulate this? That you can turn the world on its head and rise above your father's failures?
The voice grew darker, colder, a deadly whisper that could freeze the soul.
I will need to send but one to end your scheming.
The unseen speaker paused, as if savoring the thought of destruction.
Have you forgotten who I am? I am Necros, god of the undead. I control death itself. It is mine to take, or mine to give. Remember that, before you dare meddle with forces beyond your comprehension.
The scene shifted back to the wastelands of the living world, where the sage marched at the front of his army. His golden eyes burned with fury, his body pulsing with an unstoppable energy. Around him, the land lay barren, scorched by the wrath of his conquests. Nothing could grow where his army passed. Only death and ruin followed in his wake. His rage was endless, a fire that consumed everything in its path. Each village that fell beneath his feet only fueled the hunger for more. He sought his next conquest, the next place to bring under his heel. The lands ahead were empty, but the sage knew he would find something, someone worth crushing soon enough. The time of man was over. The world now belonged to the sage, and his march of death would never cease. But in the shadows of his destruction, something darker waited. Dr. Thorn stood on the edge of a cliff, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sage's army continued its relentless march. His lips curled into a smile, a slow, deliberate expression of both satisfaction and amusement. The destruction was unfolding perfectly, just as he had planned. And yet, Necros's voice, the god of the undead, echoed in his mind, mocking, threatening, dismissing him as little more than a fool. Thorn's smile widened. He watched. He waited. Necros, he muttered softly to himself. You dare to underestimate me. He knew exactly what the god was planning. Necros believed he could stop this, the rising tide of elders, the destruction of the world's balance, by sending a champion, some being powerful enough to defeat the sage and his army. But Thorn saw further ahead. He saw the flaw in Necros's thinking. When you summon something powerful enough to defeat the sage and his army, Thorn mused, his voice carrying a dark amusement, that will be the very thing that shatters the balance you so desperately cling to. He chuckled softly to himself, his eyes gleaming with wicked anticipation. And when that balance breaks, he continued, you will have no choice but to come crawling to me, begging for my aid, I cannot wait to see who you will bring to face the sage, Necros. What creature could you possibly summon to turn the tide? The thought of Necros, scrambling to fix the chaos he'd unwittingly unleashed, filled Thorn with a sense of triumph. The god thought he could manipulate the pieces on the board, that he could control the outcome. But Thorn had already set his plans into motion, far deeper than Necros could see. Even if the god somehow managed to overcome the sage, it wouldn't matter. Thorn had been working quietly, patiently, behind the scenes. I've already started to amass my own force, Thorn whispered. A special group of elders, handpicked and bound to my will. Elders who serve me, and me alone. And I am far from done. Thorn's smile grew sharper as he imagined the future. As time passed, more and more elders would join him. They would be drawn to his power, to his vision. His army of elders would become something far greater than what even the sage commanded, a force so strong, so unyielding, that not even Necros or the gods themselves could stand against it. We shall grow stronger, Thorn murmured, until we are unstoppable, and not even you, Necros, will be able to challenge us. He took a final glance at the distant battlefield, where the sage continued his conquest, unaware of the storm that brewed behind him. Thorn's plans were already in motion, and soon the gods would have no choice but to acknowledge his power. They would see him not as a threat, but as the inevitable ruler of the supernatural realms. Thorn turned away from the cliff, his mind sharp, his patience endless. He was in no rush. Let Necros play his hand. Let him summon his champion. Whatever came, Dr. Thorn was prepared. Watch carefully, Necros, he whispered, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. You'll come to me soon enough. And when that day came, it would be Thorn who held all the power. The sage's army marched relentlessly, scorching the earth, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The air was thick with death, the land barren beneath the tread of thousands of elders. But as they approached their next conquest, the sage stopped abruptly. Something powerful, something ancient, stirred ahead. The very earth beneath his feet trembled, and the ground around him began to shift unnaturally. He could feel it. This was not just another foe. This was something deeper, something tied to his past. The soil began to bubble, the earth cracking open as a hand, gnarled and weathered, clawed its way up from the darkness. The ground shook violently, and the sage stood motionless, knowing what was coming. A single figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness, indistinguishable to his army. But the sage knew. As lightning split the sky, it illuminated the face of the figure. It was Kalen, the elder who had once turned the sage from man to vampire, the elder who had placed his faith in the wisdom of Mephion, the name the sage once bore, the elder who had sacrificed himself so that the sage might live. Necros had returned Kalen from the dead, playing a move unseen by Dr. Thorn. This was Necros's answer, his counter to the sage's madness, a being more powerful than any other, a being who knew the sage's mind, his heart. Kalen approached with a slow, deliberate step, his presence undeniable. The sage's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of his old mentor. You are dead. The sage's voice was low, filled with confusion and anger. I saw you destroyed myself. You sacrificed yourself for me, so that I may live. How is this possible? Oh, Kalen's eyes were piercing, filled with sadness and disappointment. He spoke, his voice like a ghost returned to haunt the sage. What is this, Mephion? What have you done? You, who were meant to guard the balance, have become its destroyer. The sage's expression twisted with rage, but beneath it, a flicker of doubt. I did what I must, he snarled. The humans were killing us, disrupting the balance. No. Kalen's voice boomed with fury. You are the one who has disrupted the balance. You are the destroyer of all things. His hand swept toward the army, standing behind the sage. Look behind you, Matthion. Each one of them was once human. You have forced them to become the very thing you detested. A collective mind, a mindless force, driven by your command. The sage staggered, his mind a battleground. Dr. Thorne's influence twisted within him, fueling his hatred, feeding his power. His thoughts were no longer his own, but Kalen's words struck deep, igniting the wisdom that had once guided him. His face contorted, a terrible scream tearing from his throat as he clutched his head, struggling with the war inside himself. I am not in control. The sage roared, the battle between his own mind and the dark influence of Dr. Thorne tearing him apart from within. Help me, Kalen. For a brief moment, clarity flickered in the sage's eyes. He looked at Kalen with desperation, but the influence of Thorne was too strong, too deeply embedded. The rage surged within him again, and he turned with a fierce, predatory snarl. His eyes burned with wrath as he struck at Kalen's frail body, his hand cutting through the air like a blade. Kalen's body collapsed instantly under the power of the sage's blow, crumpling to the ground. But as he fell, his voice remained calm, and his final words echoed through the stillness. I do so for my own sake, not for yours. Kalen's body hit the ground, lifeless, and the weight of his words hit the sage like a physical blow. They were the words the sage had once spoken, the philosophy he had lived by. I do so for my own sake. And now, in his madness, he had betrayed those very words. He had turned his back on everything he once stood for. The sage stumbled, the realization crashing over him like a wave. He collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping the cold earth as if to steady himself from the truth he could no longer deny. I am the sage, he whispered, his voice trembling. I am the saviour of the balance. The words rang, hollow at first, lost in the wind, but he repeated them, louder, more forceful. I am the sage, the saviour of the balance. His voice cracked, but each repetition brought a flicker of clarity, a crack in the darkness that had clouded his mind for so long. Finally, the rage that had consumed him began to subside. His breath steadied, and he looked up at the sky, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a shroud. The once vibrant world was now a barren wasteland, the army behind him a twisted remnant of what was once human life. A single tear fell from the sage's eye, tracing a path down his face before dropping into the dark earth. It was absorbed instantly, as if the very ground mourned with him. What have I done? He whispered, his voice barely audible against the howling wind. And in that moment, the sage, once Matthion, the guardian of balance, was left alone, surrounded by the ruins of his own making. I am the sage. His voice thundered across the barren land, the remnants of Dr. Thorne's influence shattering under the sheer force of his will. A wave of pure energy exploded from his body, sending ripples through the air. His army of elders, thousands strong, stood motionless, their once glowing eyes now dim, awaiting their master's command. The sage approached them slowly, his gaze filled with sorrow and regret. His voice, once filled with fury, now trembled with the weight of his realization. I have done the very thing I swore never to do. I, who once fought for the freedom of the individual, have forced each of you into a collective. I have taken away your will, your freedom, your essence. He paused, scanning the faces of the beings who had once been human, now bound to him by force. But no more, the sage continued. By my hand, you will be free again. Each of you shall return to the individual you once were. I will restore the balance I was meant to protect, not through control or domination, but by granting you back the power of choice." His voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "Know this, no man, no elder should ever live for the sake of another. You are the highest priority in your own life, for without you, the collective is meaningless. It is the strength of the individual that gives life meaning." The elders remained still, but there was a shift, a subtle change in the air, as though the very fabric of reality had heard the sage's declaration. His task was not done, however. He would need to go further, to undo the damage he had wrought, to reach out beyond his power, to the gods themselves. The ritual of restoration. The sage walked to the centre of the barren field, the land scorched and broken from the destruction he had brought upon it. He knelt and began tracing ancient symbols into the earth, each line precise, each shape radiating with ancient energy. He knew what he needed to do, but it would come at a great cost, one he was prepared to pay. With the symbols complete, the sage stood in their centre, his hands raised toward the sky. "Though my wisdom is vast and my power great," he murmured, "I cannot correct this alone. I need the help of those who see the vision of balance. When weak men come together in a collective to steal the efforts of others, let them tremble at the sight of powerful individuals working together to restore what has been lost." As his words faded into the wind, the symbols on the ground began to glow, pulsing with a deep, ancient energy. The air around him shifted, and 3 entities materialized before him, their forms swirling masses of energy and light. Behind them, a golden nexus of light shimmered, a radiant, swirling vortex of power that represented reality itself. These were the gods of the supernatural realms. Necros, god of the undead; Lysanor, god of the lichens; and Nocturna, the vampire god. They hovered before him in silent judgment. The sage bowed his head, not in submission, but in respect. "I have done terrible things," he said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Though I was influenced, I hold no one responsible but myself. I was not strong enough to resist the darkness, and in my weakness I became the very thing I despise. I took away the freedom of others. Even with all my wisdom, I cannot see a way to undo the damage I have caused. And so I offer myself as the sacrifice. For this was my doing. To live in this world as it is now is not living at all." The gods remained silent, their energy crackling with an unspoken power. Behind them, the golden nexus, a representation of reality itself, flared with light, shifting as if it were alive. Then, from the golden nexus, a voice emerged, calm, distant, yet filled with a timeless authority. "There is one," the voice said, echoing through the stillness, "but we are 500 years too early." The sage's eyes widened. 500 years? The voice of the golden nexus, the voice of reality itself, continued. "There is one who will be born 5 centuries from now, one who has the power to restore the balance fully. But until that time, this world cannot sustain the imbalance you have created. The cycle will collapse before their arrival." The sage's heart sank. His mistakes would destroy everything long before the one who could save them arrived. "Then there must be another way," he whispered. The energy around the gods began to swirl faster, the ground beneath them trembling as the golden nexus flickered with power. "There is a way," the voice of reality said, "but it will come at a cost to us all. The balance can be restored, the elders return to their human forms, and the damage undone. But for this to happen, the gods must sacrifice their powers, and you, sage, will be reduced to a frail shadow of yourself." The gods, Necros, Lysanor, and Nocturna exchanged a glance. They understood the gravity of the decision. Without their powers, they would be dormant for many years, unable to influence the world they had shaped. But if they did nothing, the balance would collapse and everything, gods, humans, elders, would be destroyed. Necros was the first to speak.
We understand the price. We will give up our power to restore what was lost, and in doing so, we will cease to hold sway over this land for many years.
Lysanor and Nocturna nodded in agreement, their forms flickering as they braced for what was to come. The sage closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He knew what this meant for him. "I accept," he said softly. "I will become weak, but I will live to see the balance restored." The golden nexus flared brightly, its light washing over the gods and the sage. In that moment, the ritual began, the reversal of fate. The energy from the gods poured into the golden nexus, and in return, the nexus began to pulse with a power unlike anything the sage had ever seen. The world itself seemed to reverse. Time bent, reality shifted, and the very fabric of existence began to weave itself back together. One by one, the elders in the sage's army began to transform. Their pale skin darkened, their eyes returned to their human forms, and the twisted, undead presence that had dominated them melted away. They were being restored to what they once were, humans, free once more. The sage watched as his army, the very beings he had enslaved, returned to life. He could feel the power draining from him, his once great strength slipping away with each moment. His body grew weak, his once mighty form becoming frail and thin. He staggered, his breath laboured, but he remained resolute. This was the price he had to pay. The gods, too, began to fade. Necros, Lysanor, and Nocturna, their energy spent, looked upon the sage one last time. No words were spoken, but there was an understanding between them. They had done what was necessary, but they would no longer hold sway over the land for many years to come. As the ritual completed, the gods faded into the golden nexus, their power gone, their influence withdrawn. The nexus crackled one last time before dimming, its golden light flickering as it retreated into the sky. The sage, now frail and weak, fell to his knees. The once great power that had coursed through him was gone, but he was at peace. The balance had been restored. The elders were human once more, and though the gods had sacrificed their power, the world had been saved. A single tear fell from the sage's eye, absorbed by the earth, just as before. But this time, it was not a tear of sorrow, it was one of acceptance. "I am the sage," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "and I have restored the balance." And with that, the sage, now a frail elder, stood alone in a world made whole again, his body weak, but his spirit strong, forever marked by the price he had paid. Dr. Thorne stood on a distant hilltop, the winds whipping around him as he watched the sky shift and the ground tremble far below. Something had changed, something monumental. His grin, usually so sure and sharp, faltered as a strange sensation gnawed at him. He felt the pool of energy he had long manipulated fading, unravelling before his eyes. He narrowed his gaze, peering toward the distant horizon, where the remnants of the sage's army, the mighty elders he had helped unleash upon the world, were no longer marching. Instead, they were changing, transforming back into the weak, fragile humans they had once been. "Impossible," Thorne whispered, his voice barely a breath. His eyes widened as the full weight of what had happened sank in. He had counted on the sage, bound to his will, to continue the destruction, spreading fear, chaos, and ultimately breaking the balance beyond repair. He had planned to rise in that chaos, controlling the fallout and seizing power beyond any god's comprehension. But now, this. The elders were human again. The balance had been restored. Dr. Thorne's expression darkened as he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms until blood began to trickle. His body trembled, not from fear, but from pure rage. He had anticipated every move, every twist in this game, but he hadn't foreseen this. He hadn't accounted for the sage's final sacrifice. "So, you betrayed me, Mephion," Thorne spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You threw away everything, the power, the control, just to return to your pathetic ideals of balance." His mind raced, trying to comprehend how it had all gone wrong. Then, in the distance, he saw it, the last flicker of the golden nexus of energy fading into the sky, leaving the land silent and still. The gods were gone. The power that once shaped the world, the force he had tried to manipulate, had vanished, sealed away by the sage's final act of sacrifice. Thorne's smile returned, but it was twisted, bitter, filled with a darkness that had never truly left him. "So, the gods themselves have given up their power to restore your precious balance. How noble, how foolish." His eyes flickered with a dangerous glint. He had lost the elders, lost his chance to reshape the world through the sage's army, but the gods were now gone, dormant, drained, unable to interfere. That fact alone filled him with a new, darker hope. "You may have restored the balance, Mephion," Thorne sneered, "but you've left this world vulnerable. You've created a vacuum, one I will gladly fill." The sage's sacrifice had crippled him, reducing him to a frail shell of his former self. The gods were powerless, and in the wake of all this, Dr. Thorne saw a new opportunity, a world without gods, where his influence could grow unchecked. "They will see," he whispered to himself, the rage in his voice laced with ambition. "They will see that chaos always finds a way." Thorne turned away from the battlefield, his eyes cold and calculating as he walked into the darkness. He still had time. His plans might have been thwarted for now, but he was nothing if not patient. He would rise again, this time not through the sage, but through new means, new power. And when the gods returned, if they ever did, they would find a world reshaped in Dr. Thorne's image, a world where there was no balance, only his will. "Enjoy your victory, Mephion," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "It will be short-lived. This isn't over, not by a long shot." With that, Thorne disappeared into the shadows, already plotting his next move. The dawn of a new era. Years had passed, and the world of modern man thrived, ignorant of the ancient battles that had once threatened its very existence. The cataclysmic events of the sage, his sacrifice, and the god's departure had been wiped from memory, not by time, but by the very force of reality itself. The golden nexus, the embodiment of balance, had ensured that humanity would not remember. Only the most powerful beings, those connected to the supernatural, carried the weight of those forgotten days. The balance had been saved, but only for a time. In each era, the balance must be tested, and in each era, a new reality must rise to face it. Now, in the age of technology and modern man, the shadows of a new threat loomed ever closer, creeping unnoticed through the cracks of reality, while the world turned, unaware. A new force stirred, one that sought to tip the scales once again. But reality was never without its champions. Just as the sage had fought and sacrificed to restore the balance, another would rise to confront this new threat. His name was whispered among the few who still remembered the ancient prophecies. the one the golden nexus had foretold so long ago. His name is Winter. In the chaos of the modern world, where the lines between power and corruption blurred more than ever, Winter would face his own battle. A battle not just for survival, but for the preservation of the balance that held the very fabric of existence together. Reality itself had chosen him, just as it had chosen the sage before him. But this time, the stakes were even higher. The Crimson Dawn had begun, and with it came the dawning of a new reality, where the balance hung by a thread. Winter was the one. His path had been set, and though he might not yet understand the full extent of what lay ahead, reality had already begun to shape his destiny. Just as the sage had been tested, so too would Winter. The world was not safe, and the shadows that lurked in the corners of existence were waiting to pounce. The battle for balance was far from over, for in every era the balance must be maintained, and in this era Winter would be the one to face the Crimson Dawn.